Thank you. Thank you all. When I was in the 9th grade, one of my teachers gave me some advice. He pulled me to the side and he said to me, Marquita, you're black and you're female. You already have 2 strikes against you, so you need to get it together. I was 14 years old. Some time later, around 2011, I had my 4-year-old daughter. She was in preschool. One of her classmates came over to her and said, black girls can't talk. After my daughter told me about this incident, I went to her teacher and I asked, what's going to be done about this issue? Her teacher was deeply apologetic. She was even empathetic. And she said to me, well, we're going to have a lesson on diversity in our class. I immediately said, no. No, this is not about diversity. This is about correcting stereotypes. Correcting stereotypes for the child who said it, correcting stereotypes for her classmates who heard it, and correcting stereotypes for my daughter whose identity was targeted. A little later, my daughter came to me and she said, Mommy, why did my friend say that to me? And all I could say to my baby was that I think she's still learning. But then I thought, well, who's going to teach her? Is it her parents who admitted that they taught her this? Is it the teacher who couldn't quite discern the difference between teaching about diversity and correcting stereotypes? Who was going to teach her? And for that matter, who was going to affirm my daughter's identities? After this incident, I began to wonder, why was school the place where me and my daughter first learned that our race and our gender was a problem? For how many students is school the first place where they learn to question their identity? Unfortunately, far too many. Far too many of our students hear statements like Black lives don't matter, Jews will burn, build the wall. Far too many of our students hear these kinds of statements from their peers, from the educators who are charged with their care, and even from parents. These statements are what we refer to as identity-based bullying. Identity-based bullying is one of the most harmful and insidious forms of bullying that's occurring in our schools today. It is so harmful because this form of bullying specifically has verbal, physical, and relational aggression that is targeted towards students just by virtue of who they are. So students who are racial ethnic minorities, students who are LGBT, students who are transgender, students whose native language is not English, all of those students experience a higher rate of identity-based bullying compared to students who are not in that group. So my question for you today is, what is our responsibility as educators? Well, I'm going to tell you. First, educators must intentionally affirm students' identities and not denigrate them. How often in a school day, how often in a school week, how often in a year do we tell students to embrace their identities, to be proud of their identities, to love their identities? And for that matter, how often do we tell students to embrace and respect the identities of those who are different from them? Not nearly enough. But we couldn't stop there. In addition to affirming identities, we also need to directly denounce hate and bias wherever it occurs in the school. So, sometimes you'll hear people say, yeah, that lifestyle is wrong. That religion is wrong. And you may ask the person, why are you saying that? Well, it's just my opinion. I have a different perspective. We cannot allow hate and bias to be cloaked in the argument of different perspectives. We have to call out and stand against hate and bias whenever it occurs, in whatever form it occurs in our schools. But we can't stop there. We also have to support the students who've been targeted. We have to comfort those students who've been targeted through identity-based bullying. When I got that advice in the 9th grade, I never told anyone. Instead, I have gone through my life questioning my race and my gender. In that moment, my teacher's words changed me forever. There was no one there to stand up for 14-year-old Marquita. The harm was never repaired. And so I call on educators to comfort students who have been targeted, to affirm their identities, and to say, you're perfect just the way you are. But then we have another question. What do we do about those who espouse the hate and the bias? What is our responsibility to them as educators? And this is sometimes pretty hard, but we still have to do our jobs, and that is to educate them. We have to educate them against hate and bias. According to Teaching Tolerance, administrators and educators, all the adults in the building, struggle to address hate and bias when it occurs in the school-based setting. Their responses range from ignoring the behavior to minimizing the behavior by saying it's not that big of a deal, to suspending students, all the way to even calling the police. None of these responses give us a long-term solution. These responses instead may communicate support for the behavior or simply just punish the behavior. As educators, we cannot just dismiss and exclude those who espouse hate and bias in the school-based setting. We have to replace ignorance with knowledge. We have to teach people to empathize, to understand the pain that they're causing. And yes, we need to teach people to apologize and to repair relationships. And that's what we're doing here at Loyola. At Loyola, we're preparing the next generation of educators who will proactively, intentionally affirm students' identity. That is our foundation. We then denounce hate and bias wherever it occurs. We support students who are targeted in our schools. And we also educate those who espouse hate and bias. So why do we do this? Why are we preparing the next generation of educators to do this? We're preparing them to do this so that they would have stood for 14-year-old me. They would have stood for my 4-year-old baby. And we're preparing the next generation of educators to stand for you and your children, because identity matters here at Loyola. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. I want to begin by having you close your eyes and picture yourself in a classroom. Think about what's on the walls, think about how the desks are organized, what and who is around you. Prepare yourself to learn as the teacher is about to start her lesson.
3只小猪，有3只可爱的小猪，它们都想建一座漂亮的房子。老大随便造造，围成一座房子。哈哈，我有自己的房子。老大乐得活蹦乱跳。老二呢，用木头建成一座房子。老3却想用砖瓦砌一座房子，于是他夜以继日地干起来。哥哥们想做出一新房子，他还在布置新砌墙、粉刷。
You can go ahead and open your eyes. So you just experienced a read aloud of The Three Little Pigs in Mandarin. So did you enjoy the story? What was your favorite part? How did you feel as the teacher read the story aloud? How did you feel yourself participating, belonging, engaging in the classroom? 20% of our students in US schools speak a language other than English at home. And half of those students are still developing English language proficiency while they're being expected simultaneously to learn and achieve in literacy and math and social studies and science. Here in the Chicagoland area, double those numbers. That large and growing subgroup of English learners is incredibly diverse in cultural background, country of origin, home language, generation of immigration, previous schooling, language and literacy abilities, and on and on and on. But the educational institution has not kept up with this diversification of schools. The large majority of educators enter our schools with very little preparation for English learners. And unfortunately, these schools are often typified by deficit-based policies and practices that can easily and often unknowingly become the norm that guides daily practice with kids. So really good work is being done, both here at the university and out at many schools here in the Chicagoland area. But in the meantime, here are 5 things that you all can do tomorrow to support English learners in classrooms and schools. First, learn students' names. This is an incredibly simple idea, but can be incredibly complex considering the diversifying world that we live in with unique and diverse names from around the globe. We often have really good intentions when we try to make students' names fit into our American English frame of reference, but we have to go beyond good intentions. I've been in and out of a lot of classrooms. There was many stories I could pick from for this, but there was one time there was this middle school student who was incredibly checked out of a lesson, and the teacher kept calling him Georgie. And I walked around and I said, "Sweetheart, what's your name?" And he goes, "My name's Jorge. They've been calling me Georgie here since kindergarten." Could you imagine 8 years of school with someone calling you by the wrong name and what that would do to your engagement and your sense of belonging and your wanting to be there to learn? So figure out students' names, ask them their names, ask them again, make sure you're pronouncing it right, say it again over and over. Make sure you're accurately and appropriately capturing this important piece of a student's identity. Number 2, find relevant materials. Kids need to see themselves in the texts and the materials that we use in classrooms. It supports learning, comprehension, engagement, and belonging overall. But let's be honest, 95% of the texts and materials that we use in classrooms and schools represent the so-called American mainstream, white, middle class, English dominant. It takes some work to find texts and materials that match our students in classrooms, but it's so worth the effort. In my culturally relevant lit class, I work with a lot of teachers, and there's one memory I have of an early childhood special education teacher who worked so hard to find texts to match the incredibly diverse, small classroom that she had. She takes this pile of text into her classroom, and there was one student in particular. It was a Tamil-speaking boy who had autism. His family had immigrated from India. And he ran over and he grabbed the text that portrayed the Indian family and he hugged it and he said, "This is me." There are so many stories like that that teachers have had about the power of relevant texts and materials in the classroom. From kids just being so excited to see someone who looks like them in a text, to wanting to read texts more, to a high school boy who said he had never, in high school, read a text from cover to cover until the teacher gave him a Matt de la Peña text that he could not put down. So cultural relevance matters. So find texts that kids can connect to in the classroom. Number 3, promote home languages. One of the more cringe-worthy statements that I hear when I'm out at schools is that a kid doesn't have a language. This couldn't be further from the truth because this assumes that English is the only language that matters in schools, when in fact we know that this couldn't be further from the truth. Decades of research has confirmed the myriad benefits of using students' home languages in classrooms and schools to develop content, to develop English language proficiency, to promote bilingualism and biliteracy. But besides these more long-term achievements, it really helps in the short term as well, making students feel like they belong and engage more in the classroom. Think about just now as you were in the Mandarin classroom. You were there for 20 seconds, by the way. Imagine you were there for an 8-hour school day. What would it feel like to have a classmate or a teacher speak to you in your home language, or to tell you to turn and talk to your partner in a home language? Imagine the power that has just for that one moment to be able to connect and see the value. So use students' home language in the classroom, encourage them to use the language in the classroom, and really embrace students' emergent bilingualism for the amazing asset that it is. Number 4, Scaffold your language. One of the things we've been doing for decades with English learners in classrooms is simplifying the curriculum that we teach. We don't just reduce the language load, but we reduce the rigor and subsequently our expectations for students as learners. So first off, let's remember that all students enter our classrooms incredibly capable and ready to learn, and students that are English learners are no different. English is not a prerequisite to being smart and capable. When all of you are in that Chinese classroom right now, your intellect and ability did not change because of the language being used by the teacher. So maintain high expectations for students. Provide rigorous content, but recognize that the language that you use to teach that content can indeed be challenging. So consider how you use language, particularly the language that might be demanding for your students, and scaffold accordingly to provide that access. But above all, maintain high expectations and let your bilingual learners amaze and achieve. Number 5, wait. We have so much to do in our classrooms. There's so many students, there's so many standards, there's so much stuff to teach, right? That one thing that we often don't give our students that they need so much is just time. Wait time is one of the simplest things that you can do as an educator. Ask a question, pose a prompt, and then wait. All of our students need time to process, but some of our students need more time because of the cognitive and linguistic things going on in their head. You might pose a question, and a student might translate that question in their head, answer the question in their home language, translate it back into English, and then, and only then, are they ready to answer the question. So take a deep breath, and before you pull out that popsicle stick or call on Johnny or Susie, who always raise their hand first, just take a deep breath and wait, and give those bilingual brains the time that they need to work. So these ideas are not the extent of working with English learners by any means, but short of coming to Loyola and learning all about teaching English language learners, this is a great start to really recognize students' asset and use that as the foundation for really meaningful practice in classrooms and schools. This can begin to make students feel safe and welcome and comfortable and really ready to learn in classroom settings. But in addition to that, this isn't just powerful for work with students, it's also powerful for work with other educators. As educators, what you do and say matters, not just for students, but for other educators around you. When you focus on students' strengths and their assets and their resources, their names and identities, their cultural backgrounds, their home languages, their cognitive and academic abilities, you have the potential to shift the discourse of your colleagues as well by focusing on what students can do, not on what students can't do, which is often that deficit-based nature that we see in our schools. So while these steps might seem small, they can really serve as the foundation for bigger, broader work in classrooms and schools that can open the doors to more accessible, equitable, and inclusive settings for our English learners. Thank you.
I'm Catholic, if you didn't guess from the introduction, right? And I'm gonna start with a confession. Thanksgiving is coming up, and it used to cause fear in my heart, all right? Because this is what I sort of envisioned, go ahead and turn. This is what I envisioned our Thanksgiving table to be like. This sort of beautiful, kind of Martha Stewart-like kind of thing with matching plates and things like that. But in essence, this is what our Thanksgiving table looked like. The reality of it is that my wife comes from a large Italian Catholic family, right? And we have 5 kids. And so we had tons of people at our house for Thanksgiving. And so like most families, because we couldn't fit around our Thanksgiving table. So what we had to do is we had the big table and we had the kids' table. I see all the nods of acknowledgement there. So it didn't always go as well as we wanted. because when we started making table assignments, we started relegating those without the voice to the kids' table, the ones that wouldn't fight us too much to the kids' table. It didn't always seem to be like Thanksgiving. We weren't all at the same table. We weren't at the place where all of us could belong and all of us participate. And so it took us a while to figure this one out, but we realized if we brought the patio table in and placed it alongside our regular dining room table, we had enough room. We all could fit at the table. And isn't that what this is about, is all being at the table at the same place? So you're all thinking right now, why is he talking about tables and Thanksgiving, right? The reality of it is, our Catholic schools are tables. Some are invited to sit at the big table. Some might be invited to sit, but only at the kids' table, and some are not invited at all. The reality is that students with disabilities, since 1999, don't get services from the federal government. We used to prior to 1999. But since 1999, and then reauthorized again in 2004 regulations, students don't get that same level of support, which means that Catholic schools don't have a legacy necessarily of serving students with disabilities. So what can happen is they're not compelled to provide those kinds of services, so oftentimes students with disabilities may not be able to attend Catholic schools. Now think about this. If we're talking about true inclusion, going to the community-based school, shouldn't kids have the option, if they so chose, to go to their faith-based school? So that's one of the things that we want to talk about right now. So part of what we do at the Greeley Center is we support Catholic schools in and around the Chicagoland area, around the country, and some other places too, really looking at how do we start to serve kids with disabilities. And remember, there's no legacy about serving kids with disabilities because the last time this was really done institutionally was prior to 1999. So we have really a whole generation of people that are used to serving kids with disabilities within Catholic schools. So we have no structure. So one of the things that we've proposed and work on with our schools is thinking about sort of a nested version of support so that we can look at, we have to start with the classroom teacher first. What are the kinds of knowledge, skills, and dispositions do our classroom teachers have to be able to affect, change, and support our students with disabilities? But we know oftentimes, and this can happen in many different Catholic schools, but what happens is we sort of get a Band-Aid approach. So you get one teacher who will say, okay, I've got this, I'll do this, and they implement all sorts of supports, and then we have to go to next year. And we have to start all over again. Think how exhausting it is for parents to have to do that, to have to advocate year after year after year. So if we start just by supporting our classroom teachers with the knowledge and skills and dispositions around including kids with disabilities, that's one way to start. However, that's not a systematic approach. So we need to start thinking about what are the school level things. Now it's interesting, school leaders have a whole different set of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that they need to be able to demonstrate in order to effectively advocate for their kids. But one of the things that's also times missing in Catholic schools is the idea about policies, procedures, and protocols. Again, there's no legacy about supports, organizational supports, about supporting kids with disabilities. So one of the things we have to work on is looking at how do we start to develop those kinds of things with our schools. Now, it's interesting, we also have to think kind of the next layer above is supports and services. At the diocesan level, because dioceses need to start to organize themselves in a very different way in order to be able to support this kind of work. And then ultimately, we need to think about advocacy. What are our Catholic colleges and universities, what are our professional organizations doing to be able to support this kind of work? So, let me tell you about this picture. This is my 95-year-old mother-in-law and my youngest of 5 kids. She's an extreme sports fan. As a matter of fact, on her 95th birthday, we took her to the Cubs game. She had a great time, loved it. She loves the Bulls and the Blackhawks too, not so much the Bears. Now this is the youngest of our 5 kids, and this is Matthew, and Matthew just Graduated high school this past year, and he's off to college, so we're kind of empty nesters, sort of. But she is an absolute fan of sports and attends all of their sports. So let me tell you the story, where this all started to kind of really impact and makes me kind of worried about the kinds of students that we're kind of putting out there in this world. All 5 of our kids have gone to Catholic school all the way through. And the Catholic high school that our kids go to is a wonderful school, really does a nice job preparing kids in all sorts of different ways. However, one of the things that I noticed is that when I took my mother-in-law, who uses a transport chair to get around, because she's 95, and it's kind of hard to walk distances, right? The kids in the Catholic high school didn't know how to interact with her. They kind of didn't see her and recognize her as a person. They would look over her. They would have conversations with us not involving her. They would stand in front of her at the sports event. And, you know, it's not that these were bad kids, but these are kids that haven't had authentic, ongoing relationships with persons with disabilities. Now, that comparison was really drawn to me when our team, our basketball team, because she loved basketball, made the playoffs, and we went to a public school for the playoff. So as I was pushing her through the parking lot, I noticed one thing. They're much more accessible in so many different ways. Curb cuts. And it was interesting because as we were going into the high school, kids opened the door and looked at her and said, "Hi, how are you?" These are kids from the other school, right? You know, we're the enemy. But they acknowledged her, they validated her. And it really started to make me think about what happens if, as a church, we talk about respecting life in all forms, yet we don't give kids the significant kinds of relationships and chances for relationships for persons with disability. How are we preparing them? So we have to think about this idea. Are we really espousing our values? So St. Francis of Assisi talks about preach the words of the gospel at all times, use words if necessary. And think about if, as a church and a church-based school, if we are not modeling respect for life in all forms, it's just empty words. So we have to think about that. So I want to think about this one last quote from Pope Francis, who, by the way, is a real advocate for looking at inclusion. But he said, we need to see each child as a gift to be welcomed, cherished, and protected. And that includes our students with disabilities. And so if we want to include students with disabilities, we need to think about making sure that they also have that place at the table. Thank you very much.
This is 5-year-old me. 1978, when my family immigrated from Guatemala to the US. My parents were in their early 30s, spoke no English, didn't have jobs, had 3 children with one on the way, and to top it off, we were undocumented. And as you can see from this photo, which, by the way, this was not an unusual look for me. This is what all my childhood photos look like. I was a little bit serious, anxious, shy, and I was a protector of my mama. Now, in spite of all my insecurities, even at that age, I always was a truth teller, or a tattletale, as my brothers and sisters would say, and a truth seeker. Now, I never imagined that I'd go from being this once undocumented shy little anxious girl to now a hyper-documented professor at Loyola University. So I just used a word, hyper-documented. Hyper-documentation is a word that I made up. Because that's what academics get to do. They get to make stuff up. And I've been hyper-documenting all my life. Since I was 5, I was filling out forms for my parents. When we had checks, remember checks? You used to have to sign them and write them out. I was the cultural broker at hospitals for my parents. Then in elementary school, I was hoarding some more documents, achievement awards, perfect attendance awards, straight A report cards, you name it, I had it. I was building up all of my documents. And then after high school, I thought, all right, let's keep on with these documents. So I ended up going to Berkeley, undergrad. Then I got my master's at Stanford. Then I got my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. So, I was accumulating papers and personal statements and letters of recommendation and scholarships and fellowships and you name it. But I didn't want to stop there. Instead, I decided I'll become an academic. And then I'll just hoard a bunch more papers. So I did that. I started hoarding my journal articles, my book chapters, and now my very first book, where I talk about the joy and the heartache of being undocumented. James Baldwin says, "You think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world. But then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. Think about that. The very thing that torments you the most is what actually connects you to people. The thing that we hide is actually the thing that we should reveal. And for me, being once undocumented was what once tormented me. But now, it's what connects me to my undocumented students, and it's what's connecting me to you right now. This is my mama, holding my very first published book, but I use the term "my" very lightly. Because as we know, especially if you're from a marginalized community, when you accomplish something, it's never individual. It's always communal. It's always about familia. It's always about comunidad and our ancestors. So this book is really hers. Because had my mama not been born into the poverty of rural Guatemala, had my mama not endured what only a Guatemalan undocumented mother of 6 knows, had my mama had a sliver of the opportunities I've had, she would have written her book long ago. Long ago. So in this book, I tell my truth and the truth of undocumented students. But here's the thing about telling your truth. First, you have to believe that your truth is worth telling. Second, you have to believe that people are going to want to read about your truth. Essentially, to document your truth, you have to believe that you are worthy of telling your truth. So you might think, since I have hyper-documentation tendencies, that as I wrote this book, I was enjoying every second of it. Just typing away, Every page, not even close. With every page of that book, there is imposter syndrome drenching in the pages. Some days I thought, I'm not important enough. Other days I thought, I'm not smart enough. Other days I thought, 3 people are going to read this. What's the point? But I did it. Why? Because in the back of my mind, I had that picture of my mama. And I knew that this was not just my doing. I had an obligation to my mama, to my family, to my community, to the 2 million American dreamers out there, to the so-called caravan of immigrants from Central America who are just escaping the poverty and the duress that this country has created for them. But this book also belongs to Loyola University, because it's been at Loyola where I've been literally given the stage to tell my truth, to document my truth. It's no accident that here is where I felt worthy enough to publish this book. Here I have found my people, mi gente, right? Folks, students, staff, and faculty that are really social justice driven, that really want to make a difference in the world. It's been here at Loyola where I think I've truly become a person for others, where I've been not only able to tell my story, but supported in relaying it. So, hear me when I say this. Your truth is waiting to be told. You can't leave this auditorium today without knowing that I've told you this. You must document your story, because your story is not just your story. It's your family's story, it's your community's story, it's your ancestor's story. You are entitled to tell your truth. For those of us who rarely or never see ourselves represented in text, we have been schooled, educated, socialized to think that we're not even worthy of the pages that it would take to write those stories. Well, let me tell you right now, I am officiating every single one of you to document your story. You have my permission. So do it, because I said so. Your truth, my truth, and the truth of undocumented students and undocumented people are worthy of documentation. And at Loyola, you can be your own narrator. You can tell your truth. And as I've experienced, you can live your truth. Henry Giroux, an educational philosopher, says the following: if we are going to fight for and with the powerless, we have to understand their needs, speak to and with them in a language mutually understandable, and create narratives in which they can both identify themselves and the conditions through which power and oppression bear down on their lives. Loyola is a place to tell your truth. At Loyola, you'll reflect on your truth will be challenged, and you will reimagine your truth through a lens of social justice, conviction, and courage. Thank you.